Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Currently on the broadcast, we're going to continue with the reading and discussion of the book Rulers of Evil by F. Tupper Saucy to discover the Vatican Jesuit influence in the founding of our country. One program note before we continue. Tomorrow, Brother Nicholas Arthur will join us on the broadcast to continue our discussions about Bible prophecy and about how we are bound to this Roman enclave of America as slaves to the Pope. And now we'll get back to the book. Remember, in yesterday's broadcast, we were talking about the statue that sits atop the Capitol Dome. Pagan goddess of the underworld. We call her freedom in this country to distract the American people's attention from what her true identity is. And we also learned that after the decree by the Vatican of the new dogma in the Roman Catholic Church at that time, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, they plan to increase the size of the dome on the Capitol building as a direct result of that decree, and put a Marian figure, a goddess figure, on top of that pregnant dome at the Capitol building. And now we're talking about how the United States is going to decorate the interior of that dome with frescoes. And it says, in the summer of 1862, even as Thomas Crawford's statue was being cast at the Mills Foundry, Thomas U. Walter wrote to Brumidi asking him to paint something monumental in fresco to cover the 4,664 square foot inner surface of the Capitol's dome. 3 weeks later, Brumidi submitted sketches of something he entitled Apotheosis of Washington. The word apotheosis was then commonly understood in its definition in Webster's 1829 dictionary this way: apotheosis, the act of placing a prince or other distinguished person among the heathen deities. This honor was often bestowed on illustrious men of Rome, and followed by the erection of temples and the institution of sacrifices to the new deity. The apotheosis of George Washington. They're going to add him to a list of pagan Roman deities. He continues, he says, Walter responded ecstatically to the apotheosis, writing the artist that, quote, no picture in the world will at all compare with this in magnitude, unquote. He praised the design before worshipful master, that's a Freemason, a worshipful master, and commissioner of buildings, Benjamin French, as, quote, probably the grandest and most imposing that has ever been executed in the world, unquote. French enthusiastically agreed, adding that the Secretary of the Interior was also greatly impressed. Finally, approval of Apotheosis at a price of $40,000 came on March 11, 1863, just as the Immaculate Virgin, Persephone, the ancient pagan goddess of the underworld, I'll just add, was being placed on her temporary pedestal on the Capitol's east grounds. Quote, frustrating delays in manpower, unquote, according to official historians, would hold the fresco in abeyance until December of 1864. On April 9, 1865, Richmond fell and the Confederacy surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Less than a week later, on the evening of April 14th at Ford's Theater, during an instant of hilarious laughter, one of the country's leading actors, John Wilkes Booth, cried out an oath summarizing the liberation theology of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, sic semper tyrannis, which means always this, that is, death to tyranny, unquote. And he fired a shot into the head of President Abraham Lincoln. Sic semper tyrannis is also the motto of Virginia, then considered a state in rebellion. Might Booth's cry have been intended to give the assassination the look of an official act of the Confederacy, much in the way Lee Harvey Oswald's much-touted sympathy for Cuba initially gave the Kennedy assassination the look of a communist revenge? An illusion of official Confederate responsibility for a beloved president's assassination justified the elaborately cruel revenge which the federal government inflicted upon the southern states in order to bring all the states under the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. And the author adds in parentheses, he says, the inferiority of states to the federal Rome is expressed in the law of flag. Wherever state and national flags are flown together, the national is always higher. And I have to agree with Nicholas Arthur. No doubt, it doesn't depend on where your loyalties lie with our president, Abraham Lincoln. It can't be denied that immediately following his presidency, this country adopted the 14th Amendment, which didn't abolish slavery, but made slaves of us all, and raised the federal government to supremacy over the states. And that was obvious. That was an obvious strategy of Rome, to centralize power in this country so that the Vatican, through her Jesuits, could more easily control every man, woman, and child in this country. That certainly cannot be denied. Now, continuing with the book, it says, Booth had associated with 7 people who were brought to trial less than a month following the assassination. It was not a civilian trial, but a special 11-man military tribunal appointed by President Andrew Johnson called the Hunter Commission. Counsel for the defendants objected to the commission, arguing that the military had no jurisdiction over civilians, and therefore the proceeding was unconstitutional. We're kind of going through that same discussion now over the Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Anyway, it says, the objection was overruled and trial moved forward. Within 7 weeks, the commission, a 2/3 majority, not the unanimity required of a civilian jury, found 4 of the conspirators guilty. On July 7th of 1865, they were hanged. Quote, the great fatal mistake of American government in the prosecution of the assassins of Abraham Lincoln, quote, wrote Reverend Charles Cheneke, the excommunicated priest whom Lincoln had successfully defended in his early law career. He said, note 2 on chapter 22, quote, was to cover up the religious element of that terrible drama. But this was carefully avoided throughout the trial, unquote. The religious element, the fact that all 7 of the conspirators were devoted Roman Catholics, was carefully avoided because of who controlled the trial. As Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, it was Johnson himself who quite constitutionally reigned supreme over the Hunter Commission. But Johnson was also a Freemason, which meant that he followed the wise directives of the quote-unquote unknown superior, making reference directly to the Jesuit general here. He says, thus the real power behind the Hunter Commission was Superior General Peter John Bex, a relatively young Belgian who was a great favorite of Pope Pius IX, the only head of state in the world to recognize the Southern Confederacy as a sovereign nation. Obedient to the will of General Bex, President Johnson issued an executive order closing the courtroom to the working press. Remember, Rome, in her canon law, forbids liberty of the press. And that was restated by Pope Pius IX himself in his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864. Continuing, it says, at the end of each day, officials would ration to selected reporters from the Associated Press news carefully evaluated to keep the religious element out of the public conscience. Charles Chinnicky tirelessly investigated the assassination. After the conspirators were executed, he went incognito to Washington and found that, quote, not a single one of the government men would discuss it with me except after I had given my word of honor that I would never mention their names. I saw with a profound distress that the influence of Rome was almost supreme in Washington. I could not find a single statesman who would dare to face the nefarious influences and fight it down, unquote. One official told him, quote, this was not through cowardice, as you might think, but through a wisdom you ought to approve if you cannot admire it, unquote. Had there not been censorship, had the witnesses been pressed a little further, quote, many priests would have been compromised, for Mary Surratt, that's one of 4 executed conspirators, Mary Surratt, John Surratt's mother, her house was their common rendezvous, that is, of the team of assassinations and the Jesuit priests who were their advisors. I'm adding, and it says, it is more than probable that several of them might have been hanged. So Mary Surratt's house was a meeting place where the entire assassination was plotted. Mary was hanged, John Surratt escaped, and wound up serving in the Pope's Zouave Guards at the Vatican. And the press did all they could to never disclose the fact that the Roman Catholic Church was directly responsible for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And the author continues, he said, 30 years after the assassination, a member of the Hunter Commission, Brigadier General Thomas M. Harris, published a small book revealing that Lincoln's assassination had actually been a Jesuit murder plot to extirpate a Protestant ruler. Harris states, quote, it is a fact well established that the headquarters of the conspiracy was the house of a Roman Catholic family, of which Mrs. Mary E. Surratt was the head, and that all of its inmates, including a number of boarders, were devoted members of the Roman Catholic Church. This house was the meeting place, the council chamber of Booth and his co-conspirators, including Mrs. Mary E. Surratt and her son, John H. Surratt, who next to Booth were the most active members of the conspiracy. Unquote. He says, Commissioner Thomas M. Harris went on to relate that Mary Surratt's son John had been a Confederate spy for 3 years, quote, passing back and forth between Washington and Richmond, and from Richmond to Canada and back as a bearer of dispatches, unquote. John's mentor during this period was a Jesuit, Father F.B. Wygant, president of Gonzaga College, and a priest noted for his sympathies for the Confederacy. John introduced Father Wygant to his mother, and the priest became Mary Surratt's confessor and spiritual director. As well, Father Wygant gave spiritual direction to the famous John Wilkes Booth, who, though a drunkard, a libertine, and utterly indifferent to matters of religion, was spiritually attracted to him. Quote, the wily Jesuit, sympathizing with Booth in his political views and in the hope of destroying our government and establishing the Confederacy, was able to convert him to Catholicism, unquote. Hard evidence of that conversion was found on the assassin's corpse. Quote, on examination of Booth's person after his death, it was found that he was wearing a Catholic medal under his vest and over his heart, unquote. At the conspiracy trial, Father Wygant testified to Mary Elizabeth Surratt's, quote, good Christian character, unquote, even assuming her complicity in the assassination. Wygant, as a Jesuit, could truly say Surratt was a good Christian simply by reserving mentally, remember the Jesuit mental reservation, one of the great gifts of the Jesuit priest, to be able to equivocate and to reserve mentally so as in order to justify telling lies. It's called Jesuit casuistry. And he said Wygant, as a Jesuit, could truthfully say Surratt was a good Christian simply by reserving mentally or in his mind, that by Christian he meant Roman Catholic, B, that under the terms of the Directorium Inquisitorum, which was mentioned in Chapter 8 of this book, quote, every individual may kill a heretic, unquote, and C, that President Lincoln was twice a heretic, for his Protestantism and for his having successfully defended an excommunicated priest, speaking directly of Charles Chinnicky. But Mary Surratt, after all, quote, kept the nest that hatched the egg, unquote, as President Johnson put it, and was hanged. Conditional to her death sentence was a provision that a petition for mercy would be attached and sent to Johnson. By execution day, July 7, 1865, Surratt's daughter Anna had heard nothing from the president. Distraught, she appeared at the White House to beg him for clemency. Two government men stood in her way. Preston King and Senator James Henry Lane denied her access to the president, who later declared that he never received any petition for mercy. The following November, Preston King drowned, his body laden with weights. In March, Senator Lane shot himself. And the author writes in parentheses, he says, in the judgment of one modern investigator, quote, some person or persons were apparently determined that Mary Surratt should live, unquote. Shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court rendered a landmark decision that would have won all the conspirators a jury trial. Ex parte Milligan held that military courts have no jurisdiction over civilians. Milligan lent Mary Surratt's death at the hands of the Protestants an aura of tragedy and Catholic martyrdom. Charles Chinnicky obtained important testimony supporting a widely held suspicion of Jesuit responsibility for the assassination. He received from Reverend Francis A. Conwell, chaplain of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, a sworn affidavit saying that on April 14, 1865, he was visiting St. Joseph, Minnesota, location of a Roman Catholic seminary. Reverend Conwell swore that at about 6 o'clock that evening, the man in charge of the seminary, a storekeeper by the name of J.H. Linneman, told him and another visitor, H.P. Bennett, that President Lincoln had just been killed, unquote. And we'll continue with more enlightening information about this news that arrived in Minnesota. And you'll be shocked. We'll return right after the break.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update, keep this broadcast on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who pays the bills. Now, continuing with rulers of evil and F. Tupper Saucy's discussions about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, he's revealing a startling truth here. He says Charles Chinnicky obtained important testimony supporting a widely held suspicion of Jesuit responsibility for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He received from Reverend Francis A. Conwell, chaplain of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, a sworn affidavit saying that on April 14, 1865, he was visiting St. Joseph, Minnesota, location of a Roman Catholic seminary. Reverend Conwell swore that at about 6 o'clock that evening, the man in charge of the seminary, a storekeeper by the name of J.H. Lenneman, told him and another visitor, Mr. H.P. Bennett, that President Lincoln had, quote, just been killed, unquote. But I'll continue. He says, the next day, Reverend Conwell journeyed 10 miles to the town of St. Cloud. As soon as he arrived, he asked the hotelier, Mr. Hallworth, if he had heard any news of a presidential assassination. Mr. Hallworth had heard nothing, as St. Cloud had neither railroad nor telegraph. On the following morning, April 16th, on his way to preach a sermon in church, Reverend Conwell was handed a copy of a telegram brought up by stagecoach from Anoka, Minnesota. The telegram announced that President Lincoln had been assassinated on Friday evening at about 9 o'clock. On the morning of Monday, the 17th, Reverend Conwell hurried to St. Paul and reported to the newspaper that in St. Joseph he had been informed of President Lincoln's assassination 3 hours before the event took place. The paper published his report. We have now before us, wrote Commissioner Harris, that's Thomas M. Harris. Matter of fact, Thomas M. Harris, the title of his book is Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And that book is free online. If you just Google the title, you can read it for yourself. Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Thomas M. Harris quotes here, he says, positive evidence that these Jesuit fathers, priests of Rome, engaged in preparing young men for the priesthood away out in the village of St. Joseph, in far-off Minnesota, were in correspondence with their brethren in Washington City and had been informed that the plan to assassinate the president had been matured, the agents of its accomplishment had been found, the time of its execution had been set, and so sure were they of its accomplishment that they could announce it as already done 3 or 4 hours before it had been consummated. The anticipation of its accomplishment so elated them that they could not refrain from passing it around as a piece of glorious news, unquote. Meanwhile, through the Lincoln assassination and its aftermath, the Vatican artist Costantino Brumidi, along with some 70 French and Italian assistants, applied pigmented mortar to the interior canopy of the Capitol dome. They were still working when the first session of the 39th Congress met on December 4, 1865. Not until the following January did the scaffolding come down. When it did, viewers were awestruck by what they beheld. Brumidi had crowned the ceiling of America's Legislative Center with a glorious panoramic visualization of Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneid's blind father, Anchises, explains Novus Ordo Seclorum. Quote, here is Caesar, and all the line of Julius, all who shall one day pass under the dome of the great sky. This is the man, this one, of whom so often you have heard the promise, Caesar Augustus, son of the deified, who shall bring once again an age of gold to Latium, a land where Saturn reigned in early times. He will extend his power beyond the Garamants, that is, the Africans and Indians, over far territories north and south of the zodiacal stars, the solar way, unquote. The epicenter of Apotheosis of Washington is a solar orb, the sun god, into which Augustus Caesar was said to have been absorbed when his body died. From the Capitol's highest interior point, Augustus radiates his golden light outward and downward to the next in the line of Julius, the deified George Washington. The god Washington occupies the judgment seat of heaven, sword of justice firmly clasped in his left hand. Basking in the light of Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, He rules, quote, over far territories north and south of the zodiacal stars, the solar way. Like his Caesarean forebears, Washington is God, Caesar, father of his country. On the right hand of the father sits Minerva, holding the emblem of Roman totalitarianism, the fasces. Minerva, we recall, was the virgin goddess of the Sacred Heart. It was she who rescued the heart of the Son of God and placed it with Jupiter in heaven. She was called Minerva when praised for her justice and wisdom. When praised for her beauty and love, Minerva was known as Venus, the Queen of Heaven. She and Venus were often identified with each other, just as statues of both were consecrated Mary through Roman Catholic missionary adaptation. Minerva's most persistent role in ancient paganism was Dea Benigna, the mediatrix. She heard the prayers of sinful mortals and passed them on to Jupiter, in the same way that the Roman Catholic Mary is believed to pass Catholic prayers on to Christ. Completing the circular composition around the solarized Augustus are 13 nubile goddesses. These are the original states. They dance weightlessly in space, supporting a white banner inscribed with the soul of the Bacchic Gospel, E pluribus unum. Above the head of each state goddess floats a magical white pentagram. Do you realize, as I do, that so much of the language of the Roman Catholic Church comes straight from paganism? This Aeneid, these ancient mythical gods and goddesses, words like Pontifex Maximus, Queen of Heaven, Mediatrix, it's just, the evidence is just too much to pass over. Slowly but surely, I hope my listeners are coming to the same conclusion that I am, that Roman Catholicism is not Christianity at all. Yes, it has some of its trappings. Perverted as they are, it does have some of the trappings of Christianity. But it's just a baptized form of this ancient paganism. And it is error, gross error, to regard Catholicism as Christianity. It is not Christianity. The book continues, he says, beneath all this celestial revelry, Brumidi painted more Roman gods mingling with American mortals. Here is Vulcan, the god of fire and craftsmanship, planting his foot on a cannon while his workers prepare munitions and weapons of death and destruction. And over here, Neptune rises with his trident from the sea in a horse-drawn scallop shell chariot. And here the wise mediatrix communicates with American scientist Benjamin Franklin, Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the Morse code, and Robert Fulton, inventor of the steamship. And here the goddess immaculately conceived, the dreadnought Mary, wearing the pentagrams and eagle headdress of Thomas Crawford's statue atop the dome's interior. She mobilizes her sword and shield against a pack of fleeing sinners labeled tyranny and kingly power. Jupiter's mascot, the Roman eagle, glides just behind her, clutching a bunch of thunderbolts in his talons. Innocent in her flowing scarlet cape, the goddess is situated exactly beneath the deified George Washington, coming between him and the embattled viewing public, gazing up from ground level. It is the graphic realization of Pio Nono, that is, Pope Pius IX's Ubi Primum, which declared that Virgin Mary was, quote, set up between Christ and his church, always delivering the Christian people from their greatest calamities and from the snares and assaults of all their enemies, unquote. The eagle gliding behind Mary explains the otherwise inscrutable seal of the United States Justice Department, which contains a wing-spread eagle surrounded by the motto, Qui pro domina justitia sequitur, which means he who follows the goddess justice. Persephone, or Minerva, the mediatrix, when judging the sinful dead in Hades, was called Justitia, or justice. The he of the Justice Department's motto identifies the eagle, symbol of Rome. Rome follows the goddess justice, that is, the immaculately conceived Mother of God in her judicial capacity. A rainbow sweeps across the lower quadrant of the dome of the sky, from Benjamin Franklin to a young boy wearing a Smurf cap and a toga. The boy attends a goddess who reclines on a large horse-drawn reaper. She is Persephone's mother, Ceres, who was reconsecrated by early missionary adaptation as Anna, mother of the Virgin Mary. The golden boy is officially designated Young America. Although Brumidi has hidden the boy's face from us, he deserves our careful scrutiny for one very important reason. Bearing the name America, he's the only element in the sacred national iconography that defines the character of the American person as perceived by the government. Young America's Smurf cap is a type of headgear known as the Phrygian cap. Phrygia was a district in the kingdom of Pergamum. We remember Pergamum. It was the middle point in the transfer of Babylonian religion westward to Rome. Phrygia is a Greek word meaning freemen. Our English word free comes from the first syllable, Phry, of Phrygia. Phrygian caps were given to freed Roman slaves to indicate their new liberated status. Roman law regards liberty as a conditional status. Once granted by a patron, it could be revoked at any time for cause. Phrygian cap freedom then means liberty. Freed Roman slaves, by the way, were called liberti, to please Caesar. We remember from Chapter 8 how Ignatius Loyola described such freedom in sections 353.1 of his exercises. Quote, "We must put aside all judgment of our own and keep the mind ever ready and prompt to obey in all things the hierarchical church." Unquote. Of course, those liberti, bold enough to protest what their superiors commanded, lost their freedom, no matter how lucid and reasonable their own judgment might have been. They were reverted to slavery. Since the advent of the Febronian state church, the revision of Protestant liberti, or Protestants, to slavery has been so methodically insidious that it's hardly noticeable. The shackles are psychological, humanely fitted by increasing verities of spiritual exercise, like Aeneas, Anchises, Julius Ascanius, and their Trojan followers. Most Americans are indeed Phrygian cap freemen, free to sacrifice their individuality for the greater glory of Rome. The black obelisk of Calla which stands in the Babylonian-Assyrian wing of the British Museum, records the great accomplishment of the 19th century BC god Shalmaneser II. In a scene depicting various monarchs paying obeisance to Babylon, we see one monarch kneeling before Shalmaneser, worshiping him. Shalmaneser in turn offers a sacrifice to an 8-pointed star set within a bird's wings and tail feathers. Inscriptions identify this kneeling monarch as King Jehu of Israel. Remarkably, according to the New Catholic Encyclopedia, Jehu's likeness here is the only known contemporaneously rendered portrait of a biblical personage. More remarkably, Jehu is wearing a Phrygian cap. Like Brumitti's Young America, Jehu's liberty is subject to the mood of his God-king. The Bible confirms the testimony of the black obelisk. At 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 31, we read, quote, Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, unquote. Scripture further tells us that Jehu worshipped the golden calf, a sacred Babylonian icon made fashionable in the 10th century BC Israel by Jehu's predecessor, Jeroboam. Jeroboam renounced, quote, the law of the Lord God of Israel, unquote, and instituted democracy. Democracy opened the Israelite priesthood, originally appointed by Yahweh, exclusively to the family of Levi, to all applicants. Consequently, Yahweh's priesthood was infiltrated by non-believers and foreign sympathizers. They prepared the way for Jehu to make himself a Phrygian freeman, obligated to concur with obedience of the understanding in all things which his superior, Shalmaneser II, commanded, exactly as the black obelisk explains in lucid visual terms. As a direct result of Jehu's departure from the God of Israel, the Israelite nation began falling apart. It was ultimately destroyed by Caesarean Rome, the legitimate heir to Shalmaneser's Babylonian authority, as it passed down through Pergamum. Running throughout this cosmic battle of the faiths is a highly refined Kabbalah involving the concept of golden calf. The word calf in Hebrew, the language of Jehu and Jeroboam, gives and here is inserted the Hebrew writing, which I can't decipher, and it is pronounced eagle. Whereas Jehu gave his people Shalmaneser's golden and then another Hebrew inscription to worship, that is the golden calf to worship, the church militant, that is the Roman Catholic Church, has trained the American public to worship Rome's golden eagle, which surmounts every flagpole. Could it be that we show respect, affection, or loyalty toward the national eagle Could it be that if we show respect, affection, or loyalty toward the national eagle, we create the presumption of worshiping the golden calf, and so alienate ourselves from the God of the Bible, and in the vacuum find ourselves under the rule of the church militant, the Roman Catholic Church? This author provides what I consider to be a valid assertion that when we walk past these ancient pagan iconographic clues hidden in plain sight on our money, in our monuments, in the street layouts of Washington, D.C., and on every American flag, Satan's tricked us into doing that which he most abhors. And we've made our slip. We've voluntarily and without recognizing it have made ourselves slaves to the church militant, the Roman Catholic Church. She's made us all slaves and made us happy to be her slaves. And that's going to be the focus, partially of the focus of Nicholas Arthur when he joins us on consecutive Wednesdays on the broadcast. We're going to get into this. And the author continues. He says, according to J.C. Judson in his biography of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, as General Washington was planning his famous expedition against Cornwallis at Yorktown, quote, the army was destitute, the government treasury was empty, her credit shivering in the wind, unquote. Suddenly, a miracle in the annals of philanthropy occurred. Robert Morris, superintendent of finance, the highest officer in the United States under the Articles of Confederation of 1781, personally raised 80 cannon and 100 pieces of field artillery. In addition, he raised, quote, all other necessary supplies not furnished from other sources, and became personally, quote, responsible to the amount of $1,400,000 upon his own notes, which were promptly paid at maturity. This enabled the American army to give the finishing stroke to the revolution, a triumph and victory complete over a proud and merciless foe. We'll continue with more from F. Tupper Saucy's book, Rulers of Evil, when we return to the book. And while I've run out of time, we'll return to this tomorrow on the broadcast. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Stay tuned for more godly teaching on First Amendment Radio. I'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.